Hello, everyone. This is going to be an introduction to structuralism for English 208 as part of Unit 5. In Unit 5, we begin our study of various literary theories. We began with new criticism, and we're going on now to structuralism, and then we'll finish Unit 5 with deconstruction before we go on to Unit 6, where we take up some other literary theories. I'm going to begin, number one, by pointing out that structuralism, I think, is a lot more difficult to understand than new criticism. It comes from the science of linguistics. It uses a lot of different abstract concepts that not only can be difficult to understand in themselves, but also difficult to understand altogether. And I imagine that you probably had a lot more difficulty with Parker's chapter on structuralism than you did with his chapter on new criticism. I'm going to begin by trying to make a simple overall statement about structuralism that might give you the big picture. And that big picture then might help you understand more of the details that I want to talk about. First of all, let's go back to new criticism. New criticism, as you remember, focused on the individual literary work itself, and it treated the literary work as what we might call an artifact. That is, an art object, something that we can look at and study all by itself. It has its own unity, the new critic said, and it has its own inherent meaning. We don't need to look at history. We don't need to look at the biography of the author. We don't need to consult the author's intentions. We just look at that individual object and we read it closely, right? We look at it very, very closely to try to determine its meaning. Structuralism is a system of what you might call not so much interpretation, because interpretation means looking at the meaning or for the meaning of an individual work, but looking at an entire system of literature, the system that actually lies behind a work of literature that in a sense creates the work of literature. And so what structuralism does, rather than looking at individual works of literature and rather than trying to determine the meaning of a particular work of literature, looks at a whole body of works of literature and says, okay, by looking at all of these different works, we can determine how literary works themselves in general are structured, how they come about, and then by understanding that, by understanding this overall structure, we can then, then we can look at individual works and see how they fit this structure. That particular structure then is what we might call the language of literature. Now, language in this sense doesn't mean the words, the language in which the work of literature is written. It means the language by which we understand a work of literature. Think of something as basic as English grammar. When you listen to me talk, when you read a sentence on a page, when you talk to your friends and so on, you don't think to yourself, I'm using a particular language structure here. Okay, I'm using these rules in order to decode, if you will, what Dr. Stevens is saying. You don't do that. That structure of language, right, is already something that you have in your head and that you use unconsciously. The literary structuralists then, meaning those literary scholars that used structuralism to understand literature, say this is basically what is happening when you read a book. Okay, when you read a book, you're doing the same general kind of thing that you're doing when you try to understand a sentence, when you try to understand what somebody is saying when he or she is speaking. So just as there is a grammar of language with its subjects and its verbs and so on, so there is a language of literature. And we use that language then to understand the literature. I want to continue here by helping you out with Parker's chapter 3, okay? Um, and I need to look at my notes as well, because chapter 3 is a very complex chapter, and you would not always understand how the different parts go together. So I want to call your attention to some specific parts of the chapter that we're going to be using here for the next few minutes, and that I think will help you work your way through the chapter as a whole. And in doing so, I'm also asking you to ignore certain other things. You don't need everything that's in this chapter, okay? In order to understand structuralism, at least at the introductory level. So I want you, first of all, pay attention to page 46. On page 46, Parker summarizes the concepts of langue and parole, language and speech. All right? The langue or the language is the overall structure. In our case, the overall structure of literature. All right? The parole or speech, that would be what the linguists are looking at. They're looking at individual speech acts. So when you hear me say a sentence, that's a parole. That's an individual speech act, okay? Or my entire lecture then is also an entire speech act. But the structure of language that goes behind the lecture and that allows you to understand it, that is the langue, okay? That is the system of language. So when it comes to literature, then the langue or the system, or sometimes we call it the grammar of literature, is the overall structure of the system of literature. The parole would be the individual work, and we'll be looking at an individual work as we go along, okay? So one literary work, such as we looked at in one of my lectures, we looked at sheer madness is divinest sense, right? And so on. Much madness is divinest sense. Or we looked at I Dwell in Possibility. Those two poems by Emily Dickinson would be examples of parole, or individual instances of literature that are created by the system, the grammar of literature, that allows us to understand those works. All right, and moving on here in Parker, I'm looking at Parker here, okay? And you might want to have your book with you. You can certainly always put me on pause, right, and go get your book if you don't have it. We next want to look at, let me check my notes here. I want to look at page 52. Once you understand that overall concept of the general system of language and the individual instance of language, that's on page 46, then go on to page 52, which talks about how to interpret. Now the important thing here, and I'm going to read it to you, it's in the second paragraph. For new critics, the goal is to interpret the individual text. For structuralists, by contrast, the goal is to describe or interpret the larger system. And we're going to be focusing on describing that larger system. And I invite you then, all right, if you want to continue studying this chapter, and I hope you do, I invite you to read that section that goes from page 52 through page 57. There is a discussion of TV shows as an example of how we can describe a system, not in this case of literature, but a system of TV shows. And by the way, you can apply this to almost any cultural phenomenon, any kind of system of art, such as film, TV, advertisements, and so on. So it gives you an example of how you can look at the sitcom. Everybody knows what a sitcom is, right? How you can look at situation comedies, those famous TV shows, and you can figure out the overall system, or what we might call the language of the sitcom. And it is that language of the sitcom that then allows us to understand the individual sitcom. All right? So, one, we understand one episode of Seinfeld. We can understand one episode of Seinfeld because we understand the overall structure. Structuralism, right? That's what we're talking about. Because we understand the overall structure of sitcoms generally. And then, so I would go on. The next section, called The Death of the Author, is very interesting, but you don't need that. I would also, if you're still struggling with this and you want another example of what we mean by the language of literature, or the system of literature, or the structure of literature in general, you might want to look at the section that begins on page 58, How to Interpret the Detective Novel. Okay, that's similar to the other section about TV sitcoms. And then finally, I think this is the fourth one, right? You can skip over all of the other things. And the reason I'm saying you can skip over them is that I think that you can understand the basic principles that I'm covering here just by looking at these sections, and you don't need all of the other sections. This doesn't mean they're not important. I suppose I should warn you, if it's not obvious already, that this is really a simplification of structuralism. This is the way I understand it in general. All of the sections in this chapter that we're not covering are sections that go into details of what you might call variations on, or the way that structuralism can look at different aspects of literature and so on. But we're looking at the general aspect, the general theory, the idea that literature has a certain kind of grammar or a certain kind of language, and it is this language that allows us to understand individual works. Okay? And remember, by language, I don't mean the language in which the work is written. I'm talking about language in a more metaphorical sense, as that overall structure, the rules, you might say, the rules by which a work of literature is put together. All right, so the last section then is the section on page 78, narrative syntax. And in this particular section, the important information is the information about syntagmatic and paradigmatic aspects of narrative. All right, don't worry about those terms. I think they're explained fairly clearly here, and if we have a chance, we'll be getting back to those. But that would be pages 78 through 80. And on page 80, interestingly enough, Parker goes into an example of what he's talking about in a hip-hop lyric by Mos Def. Okay? So, okay. Now, what I want to do is sort of conclude this. I thought I was really just giving you an introduction, and we're now 14 minutes into the lecture. So we're really now into the conclusion aspect of the lecture. I want to give you an example. Foster gives you examples with the TV sitcom. He looks in particular at the famous one, I Love Lucy. I hope you all know what that is. It's obviously been off the air for something like 50 years. Okay, but he uses the example of I Love Lucy, and then when it comes to literature, he uses the example of the detective novel. We're going to use an example that we have already looked at previously in this course, and that is the quest. you will remember that Foster says that every story is a quest. And then he kind of jokingly follows up by saying, okay, every story is a quest unless it's not. All right? But we're going to be looking at the quest. Now, suppose you were reading a whole bunch of stories that were quest stories. And after you'd read 10 or 15 or 20 of these, you started to see a certain pattern. Okay? And then you said, okay, well, it looks as though these stories, they all have the same pattern, and they all seem to involve somebody going off on a quest. A quest simply means that we're looking for something, right? As in Foster's example of the teenage kid who goes on a quest to the grocery store to get a loaf of bread, right? Okay, something as simple as that. That's all it is. So you say, okay, I've looked at all these stories, and they all seem to be about somebody, an individual, going off on a journey to find something. Okay, finding something, that's a quest. I'm going to call these quest stories. And I'm going to say that these stories have a certain language to them. They have a certain structure, so that by understanding this structure, I can understand the individual story. Now, Foster gives us that structure, doesn't he? He says, okay, first of all, you've got this character, all right? This character is on a journey. This journey has a particular purpose. During this journey, this character, this quester, if you will, meets with certain challenges, and then at the end of the quest, he finds something different from what he really set out to find, so that the ultimate purpose of the quest is somehow different from the original purpose of the quest. Okay? Now, what has Foster done? He has given us that 5-point structure that you've already seen. And if I'm losing you here with Foster and the quest, put me on pause, go back to that chapter in Foster and review that 5-point structure of the quest, okay, and then come back and we'll talk some more about it. All right. So you're back and you remember what I'm talking about here, Foster and that quest structure. All right. What has Foster done? He has really done the structuralist thing. He has said, there is a certain language for stories like this. And by using this language, we can understand these stories. All right? Now, we can go into more detail. I'm going to say, for example, that in general, the quest story involves a mounted warrior, a soldier, if you will, on a horse. Okay? And we call the mounted warrior in the history of warfare and the history of combat and so on, we call these people knights. We call these people knights, right? And eventually the knights involved into cavalry, that branch of the army that rode horses and so on. You're familiar with this, okay? But the knight is the individual, the solitary warrior. And I'm saying, okay, well, usually this quester is a knight on horseback, all right? And he's usually off alone, and he is usually going somewhere, all right? He meets certain challenges. He runs into unexpected dangers, and he runs into enemies or foes that he never expected to find, right? Okay? And so on and so forth. Okay. So I say, okay, I've got this particular structure. I've got this language of the quest. Oh, now, it looks like, I'm doing some reading here, and I've got this poem by John Keats. It's called La Belle Dame Sans Merci. Okay, all right, La Belle Dame. Okay, I know enough French. I know what he's getting at. This is the beautiful lady who has no pity. All right? And I start reading this story. Okay? I don't know what particular language of literature to use here. There are different kinds of stories. Okay, there's the detective novel, right? There's the romance novel, and so on and so forth. Okay, I start reading this story and I notice, oh yeah, it's got a knight. Ah, and this knight refers to his horse. So it's a knight on horseback. Oh, right? And it's obvious that he's been riding along. He says he met a lady in the meadow. So obviously he's been traveling. He's been going along and he comes to this meadow and he meets this lady and so on and so forth. So I say, okay, what I've got here obviously is a quest story. Now, I might not, you see, and you probably didn't when you read this poem for the first time. I might not say to myself, aha, a quest. All right, so I am going to apply the language or the grammar or the system or the structure of a quest story to this. All right, I don't necessarily do that consciously, but unconsciously, I'm familiar enough with that pattern. After all, as Foster says, every story is a quest. I don't necessarily need to know a lot about the specific, and these quest stories, by the way, are the ones that I'm referring to are called medieval romances, okay? And Keats is drawing upon the whole genre or category of medieval romance here. I don't necessarily need to consciously apply this. I don't even need to have ever read a medieval romance or a quest narrative before in my life. Why? Because I know the general language of stories. What does Foster say? Every story is a quest. So I know the general language of stories. Now, certainly there are different kinds of stories, but I know that stories involve a central character, and I've identified my central character here as the Knight-at-Arms. Okay, I know that it involves a character who, over the course of time, does something and may do more than one thing, right? And he does these things with certain consequences. And he does these things, or she, doesn't have to be a he, does these things in a certain way. So that's a very, very, very general structure of story, right? That I can apply to this quest. And after I've read a certain number of quest stories, then I can fill in other details that are specific to the quest story, like that idea of riding off into unknown territory. Okay? Now, it isn't necessary in every story that the main character go off into unknown territory, but I know that that's a feature of the quest story in particular. And I know that, there certain problems are going to arise every story. In every story, certain problems are going to arise, and that main character is going to have to deal with those problems. All right? Now, okay, by now I've read enough quest stories that I realize that these problems or these challenges are going to involve perhaps running into strange creatures and finding unknown dangers and so on in the woods, right, or in the wilderness, etc., etc. Okay, you with me so far? Now, I'm not going to go through the entire La Belle Dame sans Merci. We could do that and point out all of the details of the language, if you will, or the structure of the knightly quest or the medieval romance. That's not the point here. The point here is to simply give you a general idea of what structuralism does. Structuralism says there's this overall system for a work of literature. No, I'm sorry, not a work of literature, my bad, okay? There's this overall structure for works of literature, these individual things. There's an overall structure. There is this language, if you will, of literature that allows the reader to understand it. If it didn't exist, if this system of literature, that is, the rules by which works of literature come into being, then the reader would not be able to understand them any more than you would be able to understand an English sentence if there weren't these rules about the subject of the sentence and the verb in the sentence and the object in the sentence and so on. Okay? So, Foster, his idea of the structure of the quest, gives us the general example of a language of literature, in this case a particular kind of literature, and then La Belle Dame sans Merci gives us the specific instance. The structuralist will say that poem was created by those rules of the quest story. Okay? And the structuralist will also say it is those rules that allow the reader to understand that story. I'm going to end with this idea of narrative syntax. Let's see. Let me get my Parker here. All right. You know what a sentence is. The word syntax simply refers to the structure of the sentence. The English sentence is quite simple in its structure. Okay? It has a subject. This is the basic structure. Okay, obviously there are sentences that are quite complex and long and so on and so forth. We're just talking about the basic structure. It has a subject, meaning somebody who does something. It has the action or the verb, meaning the thing that the subject does. And then it usually has some kind of object, which is the result of that action. There are also modifiers that tell us how the action is done. That is syntax. Now, a syntagmatic analysis of a sentence or a work of literature looks at the way those different elements are combined together into one sentence. That's all that syntagmatic means. And we've got an example on page 79. Jane interprets the book brilliantly. Okay? We have, number one, a subject, Jane. We have an action, interprets. All right? The book, all right, what she is doing. Okay, the result of interpretation or the object of her interpretation, the book, brilliantly, how she does it. Okay, so what the literary structuralist will say is, you can say that there is the same kind of syntax, if you will, to a story. We can say, substituting for Jane, we can say the knight, right, goes on a journey. All right, instead of Jane interprets, the knight goes on a journey, right, to find the Holy Grail. All right, and he does this courageously. Okay, and that could describe the overall structure of that story. That is syntagmatic. Now, if you look at the paradigmatic aspect of these things, what you see, and again, refer to page 79, what you see is what the structuralists call, and Parker calls, the vertical axis. The horizontal axis is that thing across, goes across like this, horizontal, right? Okay, that is the individual sentence or the individual story. The vertical axis gives you the elements of the story. So number one, this axis is called A, all right, or this column is called A. You have the characters. So you could say, okay, well, in one kind of story, we've got this knight on horseback. All right, in another kind of story, the detective novel, we have this really smart guy that we call a detective. And we say, okay, in another kind of story here, we've got, oh yeah, we've got the romantic heroine. We have the woman who is trying to get married, say, okay, or the woman who has fallen in love, okay. Um, so that's the paradigmatic aspect of the structure of the language of literature. Now, you can probably fill in the rest. I don't need to do this for you, but we'll just continue with an example. So column B then, the action, this is what the character does in the story, right? So we might say, okay, our first example was the knight on horseback. Okay, so what action does he do? Oh, well, he goes on a quest. All right, we said our second example then was the detective, and the detective finds a body, or he's told that there is a dead body, and so he is looking for how this person came to be killed, that is, who the killer is, and so on, right? Okay? And our third example, we have the romantic heroine, we have the young woman who falls in love. Okay, that's what she's doing. She's falling in love, and there are certain problems in her love relationship that she needs to deal with. Okay? So, you get the general picture. You've got an overall structure. You can understand this structure in terms of the syntax or the grammar of literature. And remember, we're using syntax and grammar metaphorically here. All right, we're saying literature has a grammar the same way a language has a grammar. And we're saying that in order to understand a work of literature, we have to use this overall structure. Readers don't normally consciously use that structure, but students of literature, if they are taking a structuralist approach, they do study that structure. And that's our goal then in this particular part of English 208, is to see what we can understand about the structure of literature. Thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions and comments on structuralism as we go into discussion.